Let's imagine this: a rocky island with no resources, no fresh water, and no arable land. Its initial population was only a few thousand poor fishermen. The terrain is rugged and mountainous, with almost no flat land. A place that even the Chinese considered a worthless wasteland. Yet, just a century and a half later, it became the world's third largest financial center. A place with a higher density of skyscrapers than any other city on Earth. A place where the GDP per capita surpassed that of the United Kingdom, on par with Switzerland and the United States. That is, Hong Kong. And the incredible thing is not its success. It is how it achieved that success, from an empty rock in the middle of the South China Sea. The answer lies not in genius or luck. It lies in geography, in the bloody Opium Wars, in massive waves of migration, and in a 99-year lease whose expiration shook the entire world. But here is what makes Hong Kong's story stranger than anything you might think. Hong Kong was not built by those who loved it, but by those who were fleeing from war, fleeing from revolution, fleeing from their own government. Those people had nothing but their bare hands and the will to survive. And it was they who turned a meaningless rocky island into one of the most powerful cities on the planet. So the real question is, what happened to those people? What happened to the city they built? And why, today, is Hong Kong's story a warning to the entire world? If you look at a map of China's southern coast, you will see a large, funnel-shaped body of water where the Pearl River empties into the South China Sea. This is the Pearl River Estuary, or the Pearl River Delta, one of the most strategic deltas in Asia. To the west of that estuary is Macau. To the east is Hong Kong. Geographically, these two places are like a pair of gates guarding the entrance to the entire southern interior of China. From here, any ship wanting to enter Guangzhou, the largest trading city in the south, must pass through this channel. And Hong Kong is situated right at that control point. If you continue to zoom in on the map, you will see that Hong Kong is not a single island, but a territory composed of three distinct parts. The first part is Hong Kong Island, the original island seized by the British in 1842. The second part is the Kowloon Peninsula, a strip of mainland north of Hong Kong Island, home to the historic Kai Tak Airport and the world's densest population. The third part is the New Territories, a much larger area north of Kowloon, which the British leased in 1898 under the fateful 99-year contract. Between Hong Kong Island and the Kowloon Peninsula lies Victoria Harbour, one of the finest natural deep-water harbours on the South China coast. This harbour does not freeze in winter. It was deep enough for the largest warships of that era, and it is naturally sheltered by the terrain, forming an ideal, protected bay. This is precisely why the British wanted Hong Kong. Not for gold, not for its population, but for that harbour. Victoria Harbour was the key to unlocking all of southern China's trade. But the story does not begin with that harbour. It started with something the British couldn't stop drinking: tea. In the 18th century, when the British East India Company first anchored its ships off the coast of China, they saw a massive market waiting. China had silk, porcelain, and spices. But what the British coveted most was tea. In 1770, Britain accounted for 33% of China's total tea exports. By 1801, that figure had risen to 80%. Tea wasn't just a drink in Britain, it was a national identity. But the price of that addiction was a silver crisis. The Chinese emperor would only accept one thing in exchange for tea: pure silver. Gleaming silver bars poured into China's treasury, and Britain's coffers were running dry. The British solution was both brilliant and brutal. They grew opium in colonial India and smuggled it into China. Opium for silver, silver for tea. The perfect cycle. Except, it was a deadly commodity. Opium spread like a plague throughout China's southern provinces. Silver flowed back out. Millions of Chinese people sank into addiction. In 1839, the Chinese government could take no more. The official Lin Zexu ordered the seizure and destruction of over 20,000 chests of opium from British merchants, dumping it all into the sea. This was the moment that triggered one of the most unequal wars in history. Charles Elliot, the British Superintendent of Trade in China, issued an ultimatum. Either China would accept free trade on British terms, or there would be war. China refused. And so, the First Opium War began. This is where geography decided fate. The British Royal Navy, with the most advanced steam-powered warships of the era, completely overwhelmed Chinese forces. British gunboats sailed deep into the Pearl River Delta, bombarding forts along the riverbanks and severing Guangzhou's vital trade routes. The war ended in 1842 with the Treaty of Nanking. China was forced to cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain in perpetuity, open 5 treaty ports, and pay reparations for the destroyed opium. It was the most humiliating moment in modern Chinese history. They had to pay compensation for the very same poisonous cargo they had destroyed to protect their own people. But the British weren't satisfied. In 1856, the Second Opium War broke out. This time, Anglo-French forces marched on Beijing, looting and burning the Old Summer Palace, China's most magnificent imperial garden. The result: the Treaty of Tientsin ceded the Kowloon Peninsula to Britain, and then in 1898, through a 99-year lease, Britain gained the new territories. The complete territory of Hong Kong as we know it today was formed from those 3 humiliating wounds. From a small, rocky island, Britain gradually expanded into a territory large enough to build a world-class city. The British didn't come to build a settler colony. They came to build an engine of commerce. And Hong Kong's geography, especially Victoria Harbour, was the fuel for that engine. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Hong Kong gradually developed into an important commercial centre. But the population was still modest, land was still plentiful by later standards, and the city had not yet reached its true potential. What was about to change that was not a policy or a development plan? It was disaster. Disaster came from 2 directions, only a few years apart, powerful enough to turn a small city into a megacity. The first was in 1937 when Japan invaded China, marking the beginning of what would later be called the Second World War in Asia. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese people fled the war, and violence pouring south. Hong Kong was the only safe destination. The population grew from under 1 million to over 1.6 million people in just 4 years. Then on December 8th, 1941, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbour, Japan advanced into Hong Kong. 18 days later, Hong Kong fell. The years of Japanese occupation were the darkest period in the city's history. The people were starved. Thousands were imprisoned. Food was confiscated. The Chinese were treated like slaves in their own land. When the war ended in August 1945 and British troops returned, Hong Kong's population was only about 600,000. Half had vanished. Dead, fled, or deported. The city was exhausted. The infrastructure was in ruins. And people thought this was the greatest tragedy Hong Kong would have to endure. But they were wrong. In 1949, Mao Zedong and the Communist Party won the Chinese Civil War. The Kuomintang government collapsed. A revolutionary new order began. Land was confiscated. The bourgeoisie were subjected to struggle sessions. Merchants, intellectuals, landlords, anyone with a little property or education became enemies of the revolution, and they fled. They all fled south, towards Hong Kong. This was the largest wave of migration this tiny territory had ever seen. At its peak, up to 100,000 people crossed the border into Hong Kong each month. Every month. They arrived with nothing. No homes. No money. No clear future. Only experience, skills, and something more important than all else. A will that refused to accept failure. By 1951, Hong Kong's population had swollen to 2.1 million people, nearly quadrupling in just a few years. 2,100,000 people crowded into a territory much smaller than Vietnam's Hanam province. And there was not enough housing for everyone. Over 300,000 people lived in sprawling shanty towns of corrugated iron and wooden planks on the hillsides. This was when everything reached its breaking point. A model. A city that could not expand outwards because it was surrounded on all 4 sides by sea and mountains. But it also could not turn away people fleeing for their lives. And then nature intervened in a way no one expected. December 25th, 1953. Christmas Day. In the Shak Kip Mei squatter camp on the Kowloon Peninsula, a container of molten rubber was knocked over. A small spark caught on a wooden wall. Within minutes, the fire spread through the labyrinth of densely packed huts. The night wind blew strong. There were no roads for fire trucks to enter. There was no fire hydrant system. There was only fire and darkness and screams. When dawn broke, 2 people were dead, and 53,000 people were left homeless. 53,000 people in a single night. They woke up with nothing left. No roof over their heads, no clothes, no belongings, nothing at all. It was a tragedy, but it left behind something Hong Kong had never had: a large, empty plot of land and a reason to start over. The Hong Kong government faced a choice. They could rebuild the huts as they were, quickly and cheaply. Or they could do something that had never been done on this scale. They could build upwards. In 1954, the Resettlement Department was established with a single mission: to clear all the slums and replace them with standardized high-rise apartment buildings. H-shaped blocks designed to optimize space, be built quickly, managed easily, and fit the maximum number of people into a minimum amount of area began to spring up. This was the moment Hong Kong began to become a vertical city. The city no longer expanded outwards. It expanded upwards, and the massive waves of immigrants from before, instead of being a burden, became the fuel for the subsequent economic boom. Because among those who fled from Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Hangzhou, there were not just the poor. There were also skilled merchants, silk weavers, factory owners, engineers, and bankers. All had been stripped of their assets by the revolution. But they brought with them something no one could confiscate: knowledge and skills. And under the British free market economic policy, low taxes, few regulations, open markets, those people began to rebuild from scratch. Only this time, they had nothing to lose. And that was what made them incredibly dangerous in an economic sense. Hong Kong was not like Singapore, South Korea, or Taiwan, the other 3 Asian economic tigers. Those places had state-led industrial policies, with top-down economic development plans. Hong Kong was different. From 1951 to 1971, Financial Secretary John Cowperthwaite applied a philosophy he called positive non-interventionism. Let the market decide, with the government only investing in things the market could not provide for itself, such as public housing, basic infrastructure, and education. He believed that the hand of the state intervening in the market often did more harm than good. And he was right. In 1950, Hong Kong's per capita income was less than 30% of the United Kingdom's. By 1997, it had caught up. Today, it is about 40% higher, on par with the United States and Switzerland. In 1973, the first modern skyscrapers rose in Hong Kong's central district. This was the moment the city not only felt, but also looked like a global financial hub. Just as Manhattan changed the face of New York in the early 20th century, those glass towers transformed Hong Kong's skyline into a symbol of Asian financial power. In 1983, the government pegged the Hong Kong dollar to the US dollar, creating the long-term monetary stability that international investors craved. Today, Hong Kong has more than 550 buildings taller than 150 meters, more than any other city on Earth. New York, for all its greatness, has only 320. The Hong Kong Stock Exchange is the world's 5th largest, with a capitalization of over $6 trillion US dollars. There is a detail about Hong Kong that few people notice, but it explains everything. Hong Kong never truly belonged to anyone. Not entirely to the British. Not entirely to the Chinese. And not entirely to itself. Hong Kong has always been a land in between. And that very in-betweenness is the source of its strength. When China was closed to the world under Mao Zedong, Hong Kong was the only window to look in. When China opened up under Deng Xiaoping, Hong Kong was the gateway for foreign money and technology to pour in. When Chinese companies wanted to raise international capital without opening up the mainland's financial system with all its attendant political risks and capital controls, they listed in Hong Kong. Hong Kong does not sell natural resources. It sells its location. It sells trust. It sells what British law built over more than 150 years, a judicial system that the entire world trusts to resolve commercial disputes. That is something that cannot be replicated overnight. And that is why, even as Shanghai and Beijing become wealthier, Hong Kong remains irreplaceable, at least until the very thing that made it irreplaceable began to erode. Today, Hong Kong has 7.5 million people, packed into a territory of just over 1,100 square kilometers. Some areas reach a density of 90,000 people per square mile. 30% denser than Manhattan. Its real estate prices are among the most expensive in the world. A small apartment in Kowloon can cost an average worker a lifetime of savings. But what is changing Hong Kong more profoundly than anything is not the price of housing. In 2019, a proposed extradition bill, which would have allowed suspects to be sent from Hong Kong to be tried in mainland Chinese courts, triggered the largest protests in the city's history. More than 2 million people took to the streets. 2 million out of a total population of 7.5 million. Nearly 30% of the population. They were not just protesting a law. They were protesting the disappearance of the one thing that distinguished Hong Kong from every other Chinese city: its independent judiciary. In 2020, a national security law was imposed from Beijing, criminalizing acts deemed to be secession, subversion, terrorism, or collusion with foreign forces, with a maximum penalty of life imprisonment. In the same year, the United States declared it no longer considered Hong Kong a separate customs territory. The UK, Canada, Australia, and many other countries followed suit. And gradually, what was once the reason to choose Hong Kong over Shanghai began to fade. In 2022, for the first time in over 3 decades, the number of mainland Chinese companies headquartered in Hong Kong surpassed the number of American companies. By the end of 2023, mainland businesses accounted for 80% of the total market capitalization of the Hong Kong stock market, up from 60% a decade earlier. For 25 consecutive years, from 1995 to 2019, Hong Kong was ranked the world's freest economy. That era is over. Singapore, which has long trailed Hong Kong in Asia's financial rankings, is quickly filling the gap. Banks, consulting firms, and investment funds are beginning to move staff to Singapore to handle politically sensitive work, particularly analysis of the Chinese economy that they no longer feel comfortable conducting from Hong Kong. But this is the real paradox of the Hong Kong story. The city was built by people fleeing China. And now, those same people, or their descendants, are having to decide whether to run again. The difference is that this time, there are not many places to run to. Look at the map again. Look at that small island at the mouth of the Pearl River. No resources. No flat land. No fresh water. Only a magnificent deepwater harbour and an unbeatable geographic location. 2 centuries ago, an empire saw the value of that location and fought 2 wars to take it. Waves of refugees transformed it into one of the most dynamic cities on the planet. A Christmas Eve fire gave birth to the vertical architecture of a megacity, and a 99-year lease placed a ticking clock at the heart of its entire story. Hong Kong is not just the story of a city. It is the story of what happens when geography, empire, and humanity collide with enough force to create the impossible. And the question that city poses to the world today remains unanswered. When a place is built on freedom, what happens when that freedom begins to shrink, one law at a time? Hong Kong is a mirror. And the world is watching it very closely.